Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Hunter Ohanian, the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archive, and we're very happy to have all of you here. And I want to say hello to our guest this evening, Aaron Tax. Hello, Aaron. How are you?
Oh, I'll take myself on mute. Great. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Where are we finding you this evening?
In Washington, D.C.
Well, great. Happy to have you from the nation's capital. And also we have with us tonight, Emma Bashir. Hello, Emma.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Nice to see you. And where are we finding you this evening?
Right now in New York, although just a week ago I was in Jacksonville. So normally I'd be calling in maybe from Florida, maybe from here.
Oh, well, you spend time in northern Florida, but we certainly hope to see you down here in South Florida sometime. So it's great to have you here. I want everyone to say hello to my colleague as well, too, Paula Sierra. Paula, hello, Paula. How are you?
Hello, I'm doing well.
Good, thank you. Thank you so much for being here, Paula. Paula will be behind the scenes this evening to make sure that this all goes well. And so just to let everybody know what we have in store tonight we have a conversation with our friends at SAGE. And we're going to be talking about the Equality Act this evening. And so it will be an opportunity for people to ask questions and to learn about the Equality Act and what they can do to get involved. But before we get into that conversation, let me just tell you a few things about Stonewall. For those of you who don't know, we're one of the largest LGBTQ libraries and archives in the United States. We're located here in Fort Lauderdale. We've been around for 47 years. In our library, we have 28,000 volumes of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, theater, art. It's believed to be the largest LGBTQ library in the world. In addition to that, we have an archive, and the archive has over 2,700 linear feet of materials, mostly from 1950 to the present day. And in the beginning, I didn't understand what 2,700 feet of archival materials meant, but it means if you go all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other, that is 2,700 linear feet of material. It's over 6 million pages, and it represents virtually every aspect of LGBTQ community in the United States. Most of it has been given to us by donors. A lot of it has been generated here in South Florida. Certainly there have been a lot of LGBTQ civil rights things that have gone on here. Certainly in Miami-Dade and Broward, and many people may remember the Anita Bryant days. There have been a lot of things that have happened here in Florida. And so we're very rich in a lot of these treasures of gay history. You can find out everything about us at stonewall-museum.org. And if you'd like to sign up, you can join our newsletter. I promise we don't ask for money a lot, just maybe once a month, but we don't torture people over it because we're a non-profit like any others. But our job is really to preserve and collect and present LGBTQ history, both and culture, both from the past and also current things. And of course, this talk tonight with SAGE is definitely part of that. If you are here in South Florida, please stop by and see us. We have 2 exhibitions up right now. One is called Don't Ask, Do Tell, which has been up all summer. And that's looking at the 225-year relationship between the LGBTQ community and the U.S. military. The story actually starts with one of George Washington's lieutenants who was imprisoned for sodomy. And we go all the way up to Joseph Biden's time and the fact that today all members of the LGBTQ community are welcome in the U.S. military. We have 65,000 members of gay individuals in the military. And so it's a great place where we are right now. So definitely stop by to see that exhibition. And also we have an exhibition which will only be up for a week or 2 more called Off Our Backs. And it's looking at early lesbian publications from 1950 through 2000. And what I love about that show is it really, in many ways, shows the difference between genders and the sense while men in the 60s and 70s and 80s might have been objectifying and fetishizing themselves and other men, women were very busy in their serials and publications talking about sort of important social things about creating community and political awareness and sexual autonomy, and they were talking about their lives in a very different way. So Megan Kent, who is the curator of the Arts and Culture Center here in Hollywood, did a beautiful job curating that show, and so I hope that you get to see that. I also want to say thank you to our friends at our fund, because they're the ones who make this series available to us. They're a large, wonderful LGBTQ community foundation based in Wilton Manors here in Fort Lauderdale. So thank you to all of you at our fund for making that possible. So I think those are all the announcements that I have. And so let me sort of switch my screen over here and go down over here. And so, Aaron, maybe we'll start with you and just tell us a little bit about SAGE and what SAGE's mission is.
Sure. So SAGE is the nation's oldest and largest organization dedicated to improving the lives of LGBT older people. We are founded in New York City in 1978, where we run about a half dozen LGBT targeted senior centers. We also run 2 LGBT-friendly housing buildings, one in the Bronx and one in Fort Greene in Brooklyn. In addition to that, we run a federally funded National Resource Center on LGBT aging, which provides information to LGBT older people themselves about all sorts of questions they might have about aging, to aging providers about the unique needs of LGBT older people, and to even LGBT organizations about the unique needs of older folks. To give you, one example of why that might be so important is, I'll give you a concrete example. Back in the day, the Montrose Center in Houston, Texas had a program for LGBT older folks, and they found that people weren't coming, and they talked to their, the audience that they were trying to serve, and they found out they didn't want to use the word LGBT when they were telling their friends what they were doing that afternoon. So they changed the name of the program and used rainbow instead of LGBT, and that worked for folks. And even at SAGE, we're slowly rolling out the use of LGBTQ plus and adding that Q after so many years of older folks, associating Q with stigma. So that's an example of how we're changing even at SAGE and the types of lessons that we try to teach folks through our National Resource Center on LGBT aging. In addition to that, we have a training arm called SAGE Care, which provides cultural competency training, again, to both LGBT orgs and primarily aging organizations about how they can better meet the needs of LGBT older folks. And we have affiliates all across the country, including in South Florida, which provides some measure of socialization and other activities to LGBT older folks, so they can age well with the services and supports they need. So that's kind of a gist in a nutshell of what SAGE does.
Yeah, and we know many people here in Fort Lauderdale and Miami and South Florida that are involved with SAGE and certainly support the organization and find great services there. We at Stonewall have been hosting a book group with SAGE for many years, and they are still doing it virtually right now because of COVID, but we hope that they'll be getting back to in-person in their book club, and we're very happy to do that. And so, Aaron, you're the director of advocacy for SAGE, and so that's a great role where you're out there fighting for the rights of LGBTQ elders on a daily basis.
You got it. And, Emma is key to that effort, doing our grassroots advocacy. And I'll give you an example of some of the types of things that we're working on or have worked on in the recent past, in addition to the Equality Act. So last year, there was an important reauthorization of a law that I would say most people haven't heard about, but it's critical to older folks. It's called the Older Americans Act, otherwise known as the OAA. And even though if you haven't heard of it, you probably have heard of what it funds. So it funds programs like Meals on Wheels, senior centers, chore assistance, transportation assistance, legal assistance, all these programs which enable folks to age in place in their community. That's the whole MO behind the law. And for the longest time, we've been trying to get targeting language in the law to make sure that LGBT folks don't fall through the cracks. Because of the greater need, greater rates of social isolation and whatnot, we know that LGBT older folks are in greater need of these social services and supports. But unfortunately, because of a long history of stigma and discrimination, they're less likely to take advantage of them. So right now, as a result of efforts of SAGE and some of our partner organizations, it is now federal law as of last March, that every single state department of aging, including the State Department of Aging in Florida, and every what's called area agency on aging, which are basically your county departments of aging, including all the ones across Florida, now have to do three things: engage in outreach to LGBT older people in their community, collect data on their needs, and collect data on whether they're meeting their needs. And we look forward to working with folks across Florida and across all the other states to hold their state departments of aging and those county departments of aging accountable for following the law in the coming years. So that's an example of the other type of advocacy we've been working on. One other thing I'll quickly mention is under the Obama administration, they added an LGBT demographic question to the survey, which measures how effective that law is in reaching the most vulnerable populations. That was removed in the last administration, and now we're working with folks back in this new administration to add that language back into the survey. So that's an example of what we're doing at an administrative level here in DC.
Well, it's an amazing thing too, when you think about populations at risk and the fact that we can actually put some rules in place and we can advocate for legislation to be turned into law that will not only identify particular problems and then identify the constituency that needs solutions to those problems, and then evaluate how effective government is at trying to solve those problems. That really sounds like a way of trying to be able to make some real change that can impact people's life. Emma, you said that you spent a lot of time here in Florida, but we're finding you in New York, and so you are a grassroots organizer for SAGE. Tell us a little bit about your job.
Yeah, so basically I work on all of the, person to person on the ground aspects of our work that help support Erin's work. So, Erin is on the ground in DC, talking to senators and their staff and, other policy experts, folks at the, the Federal Department of Aging and things like that, and the Department of, Health and Human Services. But my job is really connecting with folks on the ground and volunteers on the ground, getting a sense of, the needs of our community and kind of finding, policy solutions and helping them also advocate for themselves. So, we run trainings, we do spokesperson trainings, we help folks, meet with their legislators and talk about the issues that really affect them day to day. And, we do that, across the country, not just in Florida, but we do a lot of work in Florida, specifically on the state and federal and local level. And I always like working in Florida just because there's so much, I think there's a lot of, older adults, in Florida. So there's a lot of space to do that work. And there's a lot of interest from, legislators also to, follow those needs and to sort of put the LGBTQ perspective, into that work and make sure that, our voices are really represented there is really, really key.
That's great to hear. So folks, for those of you who have joined us, just a couple of procedural things. We're going to have a discussion and a presentation about the Equality Act and what it means to all of us and to everybody in this country. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to throw them into the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to them. We'll try to incorporate them into that section. And also, if you have an experience where you have been discriminated against, those stories are very important for us to hear. Just as Emma was saying, part of what her job is being sort of on the ground and really hearing true stories. She likes to gather those stories. And then what Erin's job is in many cases is actually to condense a lot of those and bring them to members of Congress, our elected officials, because they need to understand that this is not about politics. This is about actually changing people's lives and actually creating good laws that can protect everybody. So what you have to say about your experience with discrimination is very important. And be sure to remember too that you can always, if you don't feel ready to share some of that stuff, you can always email any of us. We're going to be throwing a lot of ways to contact us up in the chat. And so it's something that's important, but if you know somebody whose story is important, it's important for us to hear it. And we can do it anonymously too. It's not like we're outing anybody in the whole process, but it's important for people to really hear real stories. So let's get into the Equality Act, and on the name of it, itself, of course, I'm one of those dyed-in-the-wool guys that say, when the Constitution says all men are created equal, I'm willing to amend that to say, okay, they meant all people. Well, maybe they really didn't, but I read that to say all people are created equal. And wouldn't the world just be a lot simpler if we just had, a law that said all people are created equal, period, and then there would be no discrimination that's going on. But the Equality Act has been something which is a proposed law, which has been brought to the House and the Senate. It is taking off of other non-discrimination laws that have been passed over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And it's very specific. I think for many of us, the idea of thinking an Equality Act that would give equality for everybody would be very important. But there's some public policy people who don't necessarily agree. They kind of view the Equality Act as a way of punishing citizens for their views on biological sex. They have threatened people by saying that businesses would suffer and workers would suffer as a result of this. They've also attacked certain people in society for saying this is some kind of ploy by the cultural elite, or that we're trying to tell people what they're supposed to believe. Some people have said it's trying to infringe their rights to freedom of speech or exercising religion. And so when you think about it in the beginning, and you think about the idea, well, this is just treating everybody equally, and then others have put all of these other things on it, these other ideas on top of it, we thought it was important to really sort of look at what the act is about. And we thought it was important to see what we can do to actually try to help get equality in our legislation today, and try to help those that don't see it the same way that we do to get to the point where this might actually become law. And so we want everybody to be engaged, because this is not a political fight. This is really just about creating good law, and also about debunking some myths out there that we've heard people say. So I'm going to hand it over to the two of you. I don't know who wants to start first. I don't know, Aaron, if that's you to sort of set this up, but I think it's important for you guys to sort of put this in context with people and let them understand about the Equality Act.
All right, well, thanks so much for that extensive and thorough introduction. I know we have a PowerPoint, but before we jump into that, I think Paula has some teaser sort of trivia questions that we're going to ask folks to gauge what they know about the current state of LGBT non-discrimination protections. So let's jump into that if we can first. So you'll see there's an opportunity to answer all these questions on your screen. So please go ahead. I'm going to read through them just so you can hear them. So are there currently federal protections barring discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity? Yes or no? How many states have a law that protects LGBT people from discrimination? You can guess on that one too. All right, how many votes will we need to pass the Equality Act in the Senate? By 2030, what is the estimated number of LGBTQ people who will be over the age of 50? Question 5, what areas of life would the Equality Act cover? Housing and employment, public accommodations like ride shares, hospitals and retail stores, federally funded programs, or all of the above? And the final question, what groups of people would the Equality Act cover? People of color, women, LGBTQ people, or all of the above? So I think everyone by now has probably had an opportunity to answer these questions. So let's go through them. Let's see what the right answer is. We had fun creating these questions because some of them are a little bit nuanced, and that's kind of the interesting part of this. So unfortunately, I don't think I can see them right now. So I'm not sure I can walk down. Now I can, here's the results. Great. Okay.
Can you see them, Aaron?
I can see them and the results, so we'll see what our audience said. All right, so let's go through these and then we'll dive into the actual presentation. So are there currently federal protections barring discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity? This is a little bit tricky. So there is no comprehensive LGBT civil rights law. That would be the Equality Act. And we'll dive into what that means. But right now, there's sort of a hodgepodge of protections, and I'll explain what that means. So at the federal level, one example of this is Title VII, which is the non-discrimination law with respect to employment that bars discrimination on the basis of sex, among other characteristics. And whoops, I realized I raised my hand, so I'm going to lower my hand. Sorry about that. So it currently bars discrimination on the basis of sex, among other characteristics. And God, time flies. I guess it was last year, the Supreme Court came down with a decision in the Bostock case where they interpreted Title VII to bar discrimination, or they interpreted sex in Title VII to include sexual orientation and gender identity. So it is now effectively federal law that people cannot discriminate in employment on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So that would be part of the yes. Are there currently some protections? Yes. In addition to that, we'll add some nuance to this. The Biden administration has interpreted the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock to apply to other federal laws that also bar discrimination on the basis of sex. So one good example of that is the Fair Housing Act, which bars discrimination on the basis of sex. And now, according to the Biden administration, the Fair Housing Act also covers sexual orientation and gender identity. And I'll give you a third example. There might be others, but another example is the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which bars discrimination in lending. That has included a bar of discrimination on the basis of sex. And now, according to the Biden administration's interpretation, sex also includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So there's your very complicated answer. And then the very short version of all this is we still need a federal law. We'll dive into why that's the case. Number two, how many states have a law that protects LGBTQ people from discrimination? The correct answer is 22. It leaves 28 states without comprehensive laws protecting LGBT folks from discrimination. The one little nuance you'll see here, that the number differs a little bit in the PowerPoint. Sometimes you see 28, sometimes you see 29. The difference for that, or because of that, is actually in Florida, where your Human Rights Commission recently said that there are a number of, they took that Bostock decision from the Supreme Court and said there are a number of areas in Florida law that now protect people from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So if you count that, we got 28 states with protections and 22 states that do not have them. All right, how many votes do we need to pass the Equality Act? Should be 50. That would be nice if we really, really lived in a democracy, but we have the filibuster. A vestige of efforts to deny civil rights protections to Black people. And that's, if you read the history of it, that's where it comes from. And that is still in place and still being used today to keep down all sorts of rights, including LGBT rights in this case. So unfortunately, because of the filibuster, we need 60. I'll add another layer of nuance. Right now, we technically would need 50 because we have Kamala Harris as our vice president who would break a tie-breaking vote. If we were in an anti-equality administration, you would need the 51 because you wouldn't have that extra vote to get us over the finish line. All right, by 2030, what is the estimated number of LGBTQ people? They'll be over the age of 50. I was thinking we should have added like 3 or 10 or some small number just for kicks, but the actual number is 7 million people. One challenge here is there's still not enough data collection at the federal level. So the census, for example, still does not collect sexual orientation and gender identity data. Because of that, there's good statisticians and researchers who have to make estimates, and the estimate they've come up with is 7 million. What areas of life would the Equality Act cover? The correct answer is all of the above, and we'll get into that in the presentation in just a moment. And what groups of people would the Equality Act cover? The initial guess most people have is LGBTQ people, but the great thing about the Equality Act is it does expand certain protections, namely with respect to public accommodations. We'll get into what that means. And under federally funded programs or Title VI, it expands some of the groups who will now be covered. So that's kind of cool. So it's not just LGBT people, but other folks as well. It also expands the definition of public accommodations to include a lot of other places that we use today in modern times. So that is the end of our poll.
Let me just interrupt you for a second, which is for those of you who are watching have questions, please remember to throw them into the chat and to the Q&A, because we'll be monitoring those as we go through this. And also just let everybody know that this is being recorded, and you'll be able to see it through on Facebook. Hello to everybody on Facebook. I know there are many of you out there right now watching it. And also you'll be able to see it through the Stonewall website as well too. That will be posted up on the website. So let's get into the main part of the presentation there.
All right, I think Emma's going to throw the PowerPoint, or someone's going to throw up the PowerPoint so you can all see that as we dive in. All right, here's our first slide. A few facts on LGBT aging. We all have our own experiences. Some of us are in better shape than others, but we always like to start with a baseline of some facts about the experiences of LGBT older people. LGBT folks are much more likely to be socially isolated, twice as likely to be single, 4 times less likely to have kids, and as a result are much more reliant on families of choice. In addition to that, we see higher poverty rates, particularly pronounced among lesbian couples with twice the poverty rate of their heterosexual counterparts. And thirdly, we see a lack of access to culturally competent services and supports, meaning, if you walk into an LGBT center, again, it might not be so friendly to older folks. And then if you walk into an aging setting, it might be not terribly receptive to the needs of LGBT folks. And it could be something as simple as an intake form at a senior center or someplace else. And it says, it gives you 2 options for gender, male or female, and doesn't recognize that it could be a spectrum. Or perhaps the form says married or not married, and doesn't recognize that many LGBT folks might be in relationships for a very long time, but for a variety of reasons, mostly because marriage wasn't an option for such a long time, still have not been married and might not recognize their relationships. So there's a lot of challenges there in terms of accessing culturally competent services and supports. In addition to those issues, we see the unfortunate phenomenon of many LGBT older folks going back into the closet as they get older, and that's because they continue to face, or at least fear, discrimination. So they think back to the history of discrimination and stigma they have faced over their life course and think this is not a time to mess around when I'm more vulnerable or at risk, and I'll err on the side of going back into the closet. And you'll see some more stats that I did not explicitly mention on this PowerPoint screen right here. And with that, let's go to the next slide. All right, so here you see a lovely map of the United States and the states where there are no LGBT protections. So if you look in the fine print at the bottom, the gray is states with no LGBTQ non-discrimination protections. The red are states with full LGBTQ non-discrimination protections. The dark blue are states with non-discrimination laws lacking gender identity protections. And the light blue, or purple, I guess it is, states with some LGBTQ non-discrimination protections. It does not represent the Florida Human Rights Commission ruling. So that's one little note I'll put here for this slide.
And just to be clear about the division among the 50 states here, this is something which is really dictated by individual state legislatures, if I understand correctly, or executive actions by governors within those states. And so it does speak to the importance of people being involved at the local level, at the state level.
Absolutely. And the tough thing is you might live in a state right now that has protections, and that's great. But say your employer wants you to move to another state, or you simply want to go on vacation to another state, you want to go see the great national parks out west, and your partner gets sick. Is your relationship really going to be recognized? Are you going to be able to get the help and the support that you need? Are you going to face discrimination? So you certainly don't, even if you live in a great state, you don't want to be locked in your state and only have that to rely on. We need to make sure that regardless of where you go across the country, that you do have these protections in place.
Yeah, and we actually see examples of, the fact that, some states have protections and some states don't. I'll anonymize any stories that we share just so they're not, make sure that they're all anonymous, but we have one couple that we know that lived in a state that did have protections, but they went to visit their child in another state. And, while visiting their child, they got, pretty badly injured and had to go to a hospital in the state, and it didn't have protections. And, when they went and said, this is my spouse, and they realized that it was a same gender relationship, the hospital actually said, oh no, you actually can't have your spouse be your next of kin. We don't recommend that you do that here. Or it might make people uncomfortable. It might, the doctor might not want to treat you, and all of that. This was after marriage equality in 2015. So, we see that, people should have the freedom to move, no matter what state they live in. And the other thing that, like Hunter mentioned, it really highlights the importance of getting involved with, advocacy at your state and local level, and making sure that your state legislators are accountable to you as well as your federal legislators. Right now we're talking about federal legislation, because the path to federal legislation is it's a bit easier than going through each of these 28 states and passing a law that says LGBTQ people are protected from discrimination. It's a little bit easier to go just one law across the board everywhere.
And just to put another wrinkle in it too, as I think about it, as you put this out here, even within a particular state, there can be rules which are citywide or countywide as well too. So for example, looking at Florida right here, there is more protection in people in Broward County and Miami-Dade County than there might be in some of the other counties, even though there might not be state law there, or in the city of Fort Lauderdale.
Absolutely. And I think that's challenging. And if you live in a particular state, you want to be able to leave your city, or be able to move around and, visit friends across the border, whether that's across the county border, the city border, or the state border. And, it's a real burden on folks to have to think, like, everywhere they go, well, am I protected or not protected? It's also, we should note, bad for business. Businesses like consistency. They want to know wherever their employees are located that they have the same rights. It's hard to recruit, if you're perhaps in a state like Florida without certain protections, or in other states like Texas or Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, whatnot. People might not want to relocate there if their family or they as individuals are not going to be protected. And businesses don't like that inconsistency and want to be able to have uniform rules and laws, across the board. It makes their life more or easier. And it's, frankly, a more affordable and more an efficient way to do business if you do have that consistency across the board. So we think it's something that everyone benefits from, not just even LGBT folks themselves.
Yep.
All right, so let's dig into what the Equality Act would actually do, which will be on the next slide. So what would the Equality Act do? It adds explicit non-discrimination protections to LGBTQ people in key areas of life. And what we mean from that, it's pretty much like everywhere, every which way you would navigate in life, you would be protected. So it's where you work, it's in employment, with respect to credit and lending. So you can get a mortgage to get a house or get a loan from a bank. In housing, jury service, under Title VI, which is federal funding. And you could imagine that reaches into all sorts of elements of life. So if anyone gets Medicare or Medicaid funding, funding through the Federal Transit Administration, there is tons and tons of federal money floating down to states and localities. So if any entity is receiving any of that federal money, that would be covered. And then there's public accommodations, which we talked about a little bit earlier. When the Equality Act was written, it was written in the not the Equality Act, right? Frankly, the original Civil Rights Act was written. This was in the mid-60s. And I just looked up the definition of public accommodations from back then, and it sounds kind of quaint. They talk about any inn, hotel, motel, or other establishment, any restaurant, cafeteria, lunchroom, or lunch counter, or soda fountain. I challenge any of you to tell me the last time you went to a lunch counter or a soda fountain. Any motion picture house, tell me the last time you went to a motion picture house as opposed to watching something on Netflix, so on and so forth. So one of the great things that the Equality Act would do is expand the definition of public accommodations to places like retail stores, transportation services, hospitals, salons, and personal care providers, among other areas. So that's one thing it does. And because of that, it not only would benefit LGBT people, but would benefit the people who are already protected in the 1964 Civil Rights Law. So that's a benefit, not again, just to LGBT folks, but to the other previously protected groups of folks. So that's pretty nice. In addition to that, as I mentioned, we have, or I didn't mention this, but it actually also adds sex to Title VI. So that's the federal funding protection. So right now, technically speaking, if you're getting federal funding, you could discriminate on the basis of sex. And this law, this Equality Act, would actually change that to now bar discrimination on the basis of sex, in addition to sexual orientation, gender, and identity, in addition to all the other characteristics with respect to any federally funded program, service, or support. So that's some cool things that the Equality Act does. So again, it doesn't just protect LGBTQ people from discrimination, but expands protections for a whole wide array of other groups who would have expanded rights should this law pass.
So in other words, sort of updating the places where protection is offered for everyone, but then also it's making sure that there is an additional class of individuals who are protected who would not be protected under the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yes, you said that much more concisely than I did, so I appreciate that. The other thing I'll mention is you might be thinking, well, Aaron, you just said we do have these protections under Bostock and Title VII, and the Supreme Court has said we have employment discrimination protections, and that the Biden administration has expanded that to housing under the Fair Housing Act and to fair credit and lending under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. That is true, but there's something to be said for having something written into law, especially with respect to these interpretations of the Biden administration. We believe they are legally sound and correct, but hypothetically, you can imagine a new administration comes in and they say we have a different interpretation. We don't believe that the Fair Housing Act covers LGBTQ people. We don't believe the Equal Credit Opportunity covers LGBTQ people, and so on and so forth down the entire list of all the federal laws that currently bar discrimination on the basis of sex. So there's nothing better, of course, in writing something into law to make sure that these protections are explicit and that they stick around, and there's no question whatsoever about what the rights are for LGBTQ people, regardless of where we live around the country.
I think that's great. Now, I'd like to dial back just a minute and maybe go back to Emma, because there's a question here that I think may relate to some of the grassroots work that Emma has been doing. And so the question is, what can you do? What can one do when they live in a very conservative state or a very conservative area, and they can't get their legislators to address these particular issues? And so this goes back to the part of the conversation where we were talking about local change, both on the city and the county and the state level. Emma, maybe you want to address that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really great question, especially, we're talking in Florida. I think probably a lot of folks in Florida don't have a whole lot of hope around this issue with their representatives. I'd like to just, go back to something that Aaron said about, getting to 60 votes. Where are those 10 votes going to come from? And actually, you might be surprised, but we have, our 2 senators here in Florida are actually 2 of those votes that we're trying to get to a yes on the Equality Act. So, for Florida specifically, there's actually a lot that can be done, for a variety of reasons, especially speaking in South Florida. We know that this is where Senator Rubio is from, for example. And, they take a lot of senators really care a lot about where they're hearing a lot of, support for certain things. So hearing that there's a big upswell of support in, his own backyard and where he's from, could really matter. So someone that we meet with a lot, which kind of answers your question, is have meetings with legislators actually, and talk and share the stories. Some of the stories that I shared earlier and Aaron was talking about, is help educate them on the issue, because for a lot of these legislators, they don't really talk to a whole lot of LGBTQ folks. They don't really talk to a whole lot of LGBTQ older folks. And so our job is to kind of go in and educate them on what it's like and kind of convince them that there really is a need for this legislation. And it's not, completely hopeless. Like I said, people really care what's going on in their own backyard. So a lot of times we'll meet with Senator Rubio's, South Florida regional office, because we know that has a lot of impact on him. So there's sort of ways that we can be really strategic in trying to convince senators to come on board, because, I think a lot of folks maybe think that we only have about 50, 51, 52 or so LGBTQ supportive senators in the Senate. But, if that were true, then we would never pass, any LGBTQ legislation ever, which is just not true. We passed that last year with the Older Americans Act, like Aaron was mentioning, and we hope to do that with the Equality Act. And I can talk a little bit about some of those strategies that I talked about and being, really strategic in how we put pressure on them. But I think that's kind of the short answer of, I guess, not to count everybody out and to be strategic. And a lot of it is also about, culture warming and talking to these staffers and talking to these senators. And hopefully, over the years, we will, eventually soften them to our issues.
And one thing I'll mention too for folks watching this from outside of Florida, even if you live in a state with senators who are very supportive of LGBT rights, it's important that they hear from you too. We know that the other side is making lots of phone calls opposing the Equality Act, and it's important to shore up our base of support in the Senate to let our senators know that we care about this, and this is something that's important to us. So whether you have senators who don't seem supportive or senators who do seem supportive, you have a job to do, which is to call your senators and ask them to support the Equality Act.
And so they can call them, they can email them, they can write letters to them, but the most important thing is for them to hear from us. Don't think that your voice won't be heard. It may not be individually, but collectively, they need to hear that their constituents have an opinion about it. So as many people as you can get engaged, and even to the question that was asked about how do you get a state legislator or a city councilor engaged in it, even if they're not interested, you need to let them understand that there are people in their constituency who are concerned about this issue. So sometimes it's 1, it's 5, it's 10. Let them know that there are people who are just normal people like you and me who really care about these particular issues.
And I'll point you all to the chat. If you scroll up near the middle at this point, Emma put a link in. It goes to sageusa.org/equality time. So again, sageusa.org/equality time. And if you click on that, it'll patch you right through both of your Senate offices. So maybe don't do it right now, but as soon as we're done this presentation, do it. And don't worry about it being too late or whatnot. You can always leave them a voicemail and let them know what you think.
And I think the other thing that I'll add, beyond just the Equality Act, because we know this isn't the only issue that matters to us, is that get involved locally with your politics, go to school board meetings. We're seeing that a lot of, folks maybe on the other side of LGBTQ issues are really taking over a lot of these local spaces, school board meetings talking about, trans kids in sports. And we want to make sure that we can, respond to that and be there in support of these issues. So, attending your local school board meeting, joining your area council on aging, things like that. There's a whole host of ways to get involved in kind of local advocacy. And there's a lot of really amazing, local on the ground groups that are involved in that work too. So even if you're in a really conservative state, chances are there is someone in your community who is organizing around this, and it's just kind of about finding who that person is and just saying, what can I do?
And it's really important to understand how LGBTQ curriculum can make its way into schools and to advocate for that. And of course, at Stonewall, we spend a lot of time trying to be sure that LGBTQ factually correct curriculum is available for teachers out there. But anybody teaching history of the 20th century and also teaching women's rights or civil rights has to be speaking about Stonewall and talking about LGBTQ rights. It's regardless of one's own point of view. It's a fact of American life, and those kind of things have to be out there. And if your local school board is not allowing that, it's fair for you to ask why. Why are people not being taught that? Why are kids not being taught that that's as much of American history? Stonewall is as much of American history as the Boston Tea Party is. Those are or Selma or Seneca Falls. That is American history, and people need to at least be exposed to it to understand how they can make a decision based upon those facts.
Absolutely, and as Emma said, there's ways to contribute across the board, whether that's in the with respect to youth and school boards. There might be opportunities to go to listening sessions or town halls with your state Department of Aging or with your area agencies on aging. If you're an older person living with HIV, there's ways to get involved with your Ryan White Planning Council. So there's so many ways that you can make sure that your voice is heard. One of them, of course, is to ask your senators to support the Equality Act, but it certainly doesn't end there.
So let's keep on moving, because I know we've got a lot more here. So
yes,
I'm going to throw it back to you.
All right, I think we have one more slide that I'm in charge of, so I'll go through this rather quickly. Why do we care about this, in particular, the Equality Act for LGBT older people? So they're particularly important for LGBT older folks for all the reasons we've been naming. LGBT folks have faced discrimination through their life course, whether it's in housing, in accessing medical care, in aging-specific programs and supports. We talked about the increased risk and experience with social isolation, and decades of legal and social discrimination in employment, resulting in poverty and economic insecurity, and a lack of competent, inclusive healthcare, which results in poor physical health and mental health. LGBT older folks, as we just referenced in Stonewall, have been there at the forefront of the fight for equality and fairness for the longest time. And we believe that they have a right to empowerment and support as they age. And the idea with the Equality Act is it would finally provide them with the protection that they need under federal law and protections they've waited so long for.
Yeah, it's one of the harsh things about what you've said about, and I hadn't really thought about this, that for older LGBTQ individuals, that they may have felt empowered in the 70s and 80s and 90s when they were in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they could have been completely out. But then as they might feel more physically frail and environmentally frail as they move into their later years in life, it's forcing them back into the closet. And that's a really unfortunate situation for many LGBTQ individuals who have spent a lifetime sort of paving the way and plowing the fields for us to have a lot of the successes that we've had.
Absolutely. So I'm going to turn it over to Emma for the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about, now that we've talked sort of about what the equality is, what the Equality Act is and what it would do, I wanted to kind of touch upon actually the question that we talked about a little bit earlier too, is what we can really do about it. Where we are, no matter where we are in the country, if we're in Florida, if we're in a safe state that has protections, if we have supportive senators, if we have very unsupportive senators, we're going to kind of talk about that running the whole gamut on what we can do. And really the most powerful and impactful thing that I think we can do is, have a meeting with your senators. Maybe you won't be meeting with your senator themselves. Maybe you'll be meeting with just a staff member. Organizations very often, like SAGE, like others, Equality Florida is another organization that does it, will help organize these meetings between volunteers. And it really is, I like to think of it as sort of, writing a letter is super impactful, and then making a call is even more impactful. And then having that face-to-face or over Zoom meeting with senators is kind of the most impactful option. And, as we learned in the poll, we need 60 votes to pass a bill like the Equality Act right now. So, how are we going to get there? Where are we going to get those votes from? And basically, the good news is that we have people in the Senate who have, supported our issues in the past, for a variety of reasons. Maybe they're up for re-election, maybe they're retiring, maybe they have a growing number of LGBTQ people in their district or in their state. We've identified, these targets, and there's a whole lot of them. There are in Utah, in Florida, in Pennsylvania, in Maine, Wisconsin, Ohio, Alaska. I won't name them all. I believe there's 11 in total. But SAGE specifically is focusing on, Alaska and Pennsylvania, and Florida and Maine. And the reason we've kind of chosen these senators is because, we've had meetings with them and they've been sort of, tentatively supportive of these issues in the past. And kind of the next step is then to, convince them with stories. And we've really seen that stories help change people's minds. We've had proven evidence that stories can really help change people's minds on this issue. Maybe they hear about some being turned away at the doctor and they're like, wait, actually, I think that everybody deserves health care. once they kind of find out that it happens. And, you know, we know a law won't always fix everything, you know, like all the other issues that we're talking about today. There's a whole lot of other ways to get involved in advocacy that's, you know, beyond just legislation. But it can really help folks feel more safe and confident, you know, navigating their life, going to the doctor, traveling across state lines, all of that. So, you know, like I said, we work with Senator Rubio's staff, Senator Scott's staff here in Florida, but also with other senators, you know, organizing meetings and putting a face to the issue. You know, like I said before, again, a lot of these legislators and a lot of these staff people haven't talked to a whole lot of LGBTQ folks. So our job is to really show them what it's like and demonstrate that there's really kind of a problem that needs fixing. And they need to really take action. And there's a lot of support for this too. It's the best way. They're like, oh wait, I've had 5 meetings over the past few months with LGBTQ folks, you know, coming out in support of this issue. There must be a lot of people, if they're so in support of this, that they're coming out and spending their time and having a meeting with me, you know, over the computer, and then hopefully not in pandemic times in their office, which can be even more impactful.
Let me interrupt you there on that one issue, and I have a question for both of you, which is that I had the opportunity recently to meet with a member of Congress who represents a congressional district in South Florida, including the Miami area, and she voted in the House against the Equality Act. And when she met with a group of LGBTQ individuals, when she was asked the question, she said, well, I voted against it because the members of the faith-based community told me that the Equality Act would impede individuals' rights to practice their own religion. And so when people meet with their legislators and they are told certain things and the legislators come back with those kind of things, what's the best defense? Like particularly that particular defense that there's a conflict between religious belief and equality. I think many people who walked in the room didn't believe that there was a conflict between those two, but how do we help people understand there's not a conflict around that?
I mean, I think the very first thing to note is there are many, many, many people of faith who support the Equality Act. And I think it's one of these things that gets a little bit of outsized attention because there's a vocal minority of people who are painting the picture of the Equality Act as something that is anti-faith, when in reality, we believe it strengthens that relationship, the historic relationship between civil rights laws and the rights that people of faith rightly have. We believe that people of faith, should have, the right to practice their religion, but there is a point when it comes to when people try to use their religion as a license to discriminate against other people. And that's where we believe that it's important to draw that line. And the Equality Act, and the good news is, doesn't change the protections that people of faith already have. Those protections are kept in place. And the good news is it strengthens rights for everyone, including LGBT people of faith and all people of faith, to know, what their civil rights protections truly are. So I think it's one of these red herrings that often gets raised, but in reality, we're all better off if this passes. And Emma, I don't know if you have anything else to contribute in terms of what you hear.
Yeah, I think it also just really reinforces the importance of speaking up too, because I think a lot of us know that, for a lot of people, faith is not something that's in conflict with your LGBTQ identity. There are a lot of people who are LGBTQ people of faith. There are a lot of faith leaders that support the bill, like Aaron said. And we really need to hear from them because we know that they're a majority. We know that the majority, there have been studies that the majority of Americans, the majority of people of faith across different faiths support protections from discrimination. But we're hearing from a very loud minority. And unfortunately, a lot of times representatives listen to them because they've had meetings with them and they've reached out to them and called them. So it's kind of our job to counteract that and make sure that, they're not, getting, the wrong information about what this bill would do.
Great. Well, that really helps. So Leah, let's keep moving on.
Yeah, so one of the focuses that happens in a meeting, one of really the largest, the focus of a meeting is to share your personal story. And a lot of people probably think that they don't have a story to share. They don't really have, any idea. They just think that they're, normal LGBTQ person in America. They don't have anything special to share. Maybe they do have, maybe you do have something very specific that comes out. But we believe that everybody has a story that's worth sharing with their legislator. Like I said, a lot of folks don't really recognize what it's like to age as an LGBTQ person. So we really need to demonstrate to them, what it's like. And I put this list kind of examples here because I want to make sure that we kind of leave space for every type of story too. These are just some examples of the stories that folks tell in meetings. And we have some photos from our National Day of Advocacy where people were telling personal stories that really demonstrate, the need for a certain piece of legislation. So, for example, if you were talking about the Equality Act and why the Equality Act needs to be passed, you would want to share a story of maybe a time that you were discriminated against, or your partner was discriminated against, or a friend or family member was. But maybe you're there to talk about, access to healthcare, and then you can talk about a time that you struggled to really access, aging services. And we always say that with the caveat to, wanting to not only talk about stories that are really difficult to talk about. We never want people to tell stories they're not really comfortable sharing with folks. And also make sure, we don't want to understate the joy and resilience that is also involved, that is also, really present in our community. But, for a lot of these legislators, they just don't know what it's like. So it's important for us to really educate them and be strategic in our story, in our storytelling, and, just sharing what it's like.
And a lot of people think they have to know like all these facts and figures and all the things about the Equality Act forwards and backwards. But really the most impactful thing you could do is share your story, and they can always come to us to get all the inside, all the inside information on the Equality Act and what it really means. So don't worry about that. Think of how you can make a difference with your story.
I know we have only a few minutes left, and I think that you guys may have queued up a video of some people wanting to share their story, and I don't know who has it, but if somebody has it, it might be good to share that now.
Wonderful members of the LGBTQ plus community, some of whom have been fighting for the equality.
Hi, I am Paulette Martin.
And I'm Pat Martin. As members of SAGE, Paulette and I have been fortunate enough to connect with some wonderful members of the LGBTQ plus community, some of whom have been fighting for the equality for over 50 years. Even though there has been progress over the years, there's still plenty of work to do.
In more than half of the states in the U.S., it is technically legal to deny someone a job or housing because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. There are no federal protections against refusing someone service or access to public spaces just because of who they are and who they love. Every day, trans elders are turned away at the doctor. Couples are harassed in their long-term care communities, and there's little they can do to stop it. As elders, we want to know that our rights are protected in key areas of our life, like going to the doctor and finding somewhere to live.
Freedom and equality are fundamental American values. There are too many members of our community relying on state protections. This is not enough. We need Congress to pass the Equality Act. The Equality Act will not only provide much needed legal protection for LGBTQ elders, it will also update existing protections for people of color. Like anyone else, Paulette and I, along with our senior community, deserve the right to be our authentic selves and have legal protections from discrimination under federal law. Make sure to contact your senators and encourage them to pass the Equality Act, because LGBTQ elders have waited long enough.
Man, I don't know who could say it better than the two of them. I mean, they're just so terrific.
Got it. It's a great way to end today and to show the importance of calling your senator. If they can do it, you can do it.
Yeah, well, that is really just terrific. Well, Emma and Aaron, I just want to thank both of you. I mean, it's amazing. These hours go by so fast, and and there's so much to talk about this, and there's so many more things. But I want to encourage everybody to go to sageusa.org is the website, and so you guys can learn more about it there. And it's very important for you to become engaged regardless of your political affiliation. This is really about something about everybody. And this is really about creating a law that is going to provide value for all of us out there. And so Emma and Aaron, thank you so much for all the great work that you do. And thank you for the time that you spent in sharing this with us. And if you have anybody who's interested, of course, know that this has all been taped and that they will be able to see this both on Facebook as well as the Stonewall website, which is stonewall-museum.org. I'd like to say goodnight to my colleague, Paula Sierra, who's back there. Paula, thank you for all your great help back there. And Emma and Aaron, thank you for all your time, and I hope to work with you both again soon.
Yes, thanks so much for having us, and we look forward to coming back.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.